Today we are wrestling with, well, one of the really big ones. A huge, consequential question in modern history. What truly forced the surrender of Japan in August 1945? Now, if you just look at the textbook answer, it seems pretty immediate, terrifying, and absolute. Right, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Two atomic bombs dropped just 3 days apart. They instantly killed, over 200,000 people. And then 5 days after that second detonation, Japan surrendered. A nation that hadn't known defeat, really, for centuries.
Yeah, it seems like an open and shut case.
Exactly. It's an easy conclusion to draw. The only thing that could possibly stop the world's arguably most fanatical military force was, well, nuclear destruction.
But, when you really dig into the sources, the story is far more complex, it's more dramatic, and frankly, much more politically driven than just the bombs.
Okay.
The nuclear attacks were undoubtedly a catalyst. They created that necessary external military crisis, no question. But they weren't, on their own, enough to overcome a government that was essentially held hostage by its own militarists.
Hostage.
How so?
Well, they were operating under this incredibly powerful ideological grip of State Shinto, and breaking that took more than just bombs.
So it's not just one thing.
Not at all. We really need to understand this as a convergence, like 5 immense crushing factors all coming together at once.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, you have America's just overwhelming, relentless industrial might. Second, the almost insurmountable ideological fanaticism of the Japanese military itself.
Bushido, State Shinto. We'll get into that.
Exactly. Third, the projected, truly unbearable human costs of the planned land invasion, Operation Downfall.
Right.
Fourth, the seismic geopolitical shock delivered by the Soviet Union declaring war. That was huge.
A factor often overlooked.
Very often. And then finally, something totally unprecedented internally, the personal intervention of the emperor himself. That's what ultimately broke this deadly governmental deadlock. So our mission today is really to go beyond that headline, beyond just the bombs ended the war. We're going to try and uncover the private discussions, the secret reports that were showing just how totally collapsed the nation was. We'll dive deep into the political paralysis of this Big Six Council you mentioned.
That's it.
And recount the terrifying, desperate military coup at the very end that almost sabotaged the peace entirely.
It came incredibly close.
So we're aiming to paint the clearest possible picture of how World War II finally, mercifully, came to an end. Okay, so to really grasp why Japan refused to surrender for so long, even when defeat seemed obvious, we have to start with the scale of their ambition back in 1941.
Right.
I mean, when they hit Pearl Harbor, they'd already grabbed quite a bit of territory in East Asia, but right after December 7th, the speed of their conquest was just astonishing.
It really was. For a brief window, Japan looked absolutely unstoppable.
They carved out one of the largest empires in history in, less than a year?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Their forces just swept across Korea, Manchuria, huge parts of northern China.
And then south.
And then south into Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines, Borneo, the Dutch East Indies. I mean, they were consolidating control over nearly 20% of the entire world's population.
Yeah.
All within this new sphere of influence they were building.
And the whole point of this massive expansion, it was entirely material, wasn't it? Strategic.
Oh, completely. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds nice,
But the reality was different.
The reality was it was explicitly designed to secure the vital resources Japan desperately lacked. Things like oil, tin, rubber. They wanted to grab them from the Western colonial powers and ship them back home without anyone interfering.
And to protect those supply lines, they needed this defensive zone.
Exactly. The military called it the Absolute National Defense Zone. And you can picture it like this massive perimeter. It stretched vertically from the Guinea in Indonesia all the way up to the Philippines and then across to the Kuril Islands, way north of Hokkaido. The goal was simple, in theory.
Yeah.
If they could hold that zone, they genuinely believed the U.S. could never effectively touch the Japanese home islands.
The sheer audacity of it, but then there's the other side, the brutality.
Yes, and this is crucial context. Our sources, they detail the horrific reality of life under this so-called co-prosperity sphere.
It wasn't co-prosperity for most people.
Not even close. It was a campaign of such just total destruction and extermination, that one historian compared the Japanese troops across Asia to the hordes of Genghis Khan.
That's a strong comparison.
It reflects the reality.
Yeah.
And this brutality is a key reason why the Allies, especially Truman later on, insisted on unconditional surrender. They couldn't just negotiate terms after what had happened.
You're talking about systematic atrocities.
State-sanctioned, absolutely.
Yeah.
The most infamous example, of course, is the rape of Nanking back in 1937. Around 50,000 Japanese troops entered the city.
And in just 6 weeks. The numbers are just horrifying.
Less than 6 weeks. Mass slaughter, widespread rape, torture of civilians. The toll is almost impossible to comprehend. 300,000 lives taken, half the city's population.
300,000.
Accounts describe people being buried alive in mass graves, hands tied. This wasn't, accidental collateral damage, a deliberate campaign of terror.
And Nanking wasn't an isolated incident, was it? It was part of a pattern across the entire region.
Exactly. If you look at the total toll of Japanese military subjugation across East and Southeast Asia by 1945, historians estimate over 30 million people perished under their control.
30 million.
30 million. And a staggering 20 million of those deaths were in China alone. So you have to understand, this was a war of absolute conquest and in many places annihilation. That context hardened the resolves of the Allies. Nothing less than total capitulation would do. Hashtag 1.2, the Bushido Code and State Shinto.
Okay, so we have this immense ambition matched by this appalling brutality, but then there's this ideological firewall you mentioned, the thing that stopped the government from facing reality, even as everything collapsed.
Yes, and this is the core of the fanaticism we keep talking about. Bushido.
The way of the warrior.
Literally, the way of the warrior. It was the ancient samurai code of honor. And it demanded things like absolute courage, purity of loyalty, and an almost religious view of death.
Death before dishonor, essentially.
Fundamentally, yes. It taught that death was far, far preferable to the shame of surrender or capture.
And they had a mechanism for that, didn't they? Seppuku.
Right, the ritual suicide. If a samurai or later any warrior failed in their duty, or if they faced imminent defeat, seppuku was a way to restore honor. It was seen as controlling the terms of your own death, wiping clean the unforgivable stain of dishonor that would otherwise fall on your whole family, your whole clan.
The psychological power of that idea that there's actual honor in deliberately killing yourself, it's hard for us to grasp today.
It is. And it's crucial to understand that Bushido didn't just stay as an ancient code. It was systematically modernized, particularly during the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century.
Wait, did they modernize it?
They merged it with nationalist religious identity to create something new, State Shinto. And this became the ultimate tool for totalitarian consolidation in Japan.
And the emperor's role was central here, you said.
Absolutely critical. State Shinto relied entirely on the premise that Emperor Hirohito wasn't just a monarch, he was a divine figure.
A living god.
A living god, yes. Held to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This elevated him completely, demanding absolute, unquestioning loyalty from every single citizen.
And political theorists helped shape this.
Oh, yes. Thinkers like Usugi Shinkichi turned this into a uniquely Japanese form of totalitarianism. Aggressive expansion wasn't just justified, it was seen as a divine imperative, a duty to bring the emperor's order to the rest of the world.
And the military just absorbed this completely.
Drank it down. The curriculum in military academies focused heavily on indoctrination, on spiritual resolve, often over practical strategy or tactics. The result was the total subordination of the individual soldier to the collective, divine goal of the empire.
Which means surrender. Just wasn't an option.
It literally did not exist as a concept in the Japanese Army manual. It was unthinkable. And this is why you see these terrifying manifestations of suicidal tactics.
Like the Banzai charges.
Right. Men, often with just spears or old rifles, throwing themselves against machine guns. And of course, the kamikaze strikes.
The divine wind.
The divine wind. Pilots knowingly sacrificing themselves, becoming human-guided missiles. And it went all the way to the top generals. Upon defeat, were absolutely expected to commit seppuku themselves.
And this wasn't just the military. You mentioned it permeated the civilian population, too.
Yes, and that's a detail often missed, but it's vital. On islands like Saipan in 1944, when the American forces finally secured victory, the extent of this ideological control became horrifically clear.
What happened there?
It was just horrifying. Over 8,000 Japanese civilians chose death over capture. They threw themselves off cliffs, used hand grenades to commit suicide.
8,000 civilians.
8,000. Witnesses reported seeing women holding their children as they leaped to their deaths. And tragically, sometimes the Japanese military itself forced those who hesitated, literally at gunpoint.
So it wasn't just fear of the enemy.
No, it was deeper than that. It was this absolute conviction drilled into them that surrender was the ultimate, unforgivable dishonor, an ideology that reached right down to the very core of Japanese identity at the time. This was the mindset the U.S. was facing as they planned the final stages of the war. Hashtag tag 1.3, America's industrial counterpunch.
You know, the ultimate irony here is that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they kind of sealed their own fate, didn't they? They didn't just provoke a rival nation.
No, they awoke the industrial might of America, as the famous saying goes. They started a war. They were fundamentally, structurally, and materially incapable of winning in the long run.
They just completely miscalculated the U.S. capacity to mobilize.
Completely. President Franklin Roosevelt immediately pivoted American industries. Companies making cars, refrigerators, household goods. They suddenly became the core of the war machine.
And Roosevelt's goal was explicit.
He said it himself. Outproduce them overwhelmingly so that there can be no question of our ability to provide a crushing superiority of equipment. And they did.
The scale is just mind-boggling when you look at the number.
It really is almost mythological. Just look at ships. In 1941 alone, the United States produced more ships than Japan managed to build during the entire war.
The entire war.
The entire war. By the time the conflict ended, the U.S. had launched 17 new fleet aircraft carriers, manufactured nearly 300,000 aircraft, cranked out over 88,000 tanks.
Just staggering numbers.
And get this, half of all global industrial output during the war was taking place right here in the United States.
Half of the world's output.
It was pure, unadulterated manufacturing genius. Total war, industrialized. And this production superiority, it translated directly into decisive naval victories.
Midway, Philippine Sea.
Wait, Gulf.
Yeah.
These battles essentially wiped out the operational capability of the Japanese Navy, annihilated it.
And controlling the sea lanes gave the U.S. this strategic chokehold, right? The submarine blockade.
Exactly. An invisible but absolutely lethal chokehold on the Japanese islands.
Why was that blockade so devastating for Japan?
Because it cut Japan off from the very resources their co-prosperity sphere was designed to secure in the first place. The oil, the rubber, the tin, all those things they desperately needed from Southeast Asia.
And Japan itself doesn't have those resources naturally.
Exactly. Resource-poor home islands. So by 1945, without imported oil to fuel their remaining ships, without rubber for tires and gaskets, without coal for their factories, Japan's ability to wage war had effectively vanished. They were, for all practical purposes, a defeated military power months before the first atomic bomb ever fell.
But the leadership just wouldn't accept it.
That was the problem. The ideological leadership, the military fanatics, refused to acknowledge that reality. The war machine had run out of fuel, but the ideology kept pushing forward.
Okay, so fast forward to the summer of 1945. The situation is pretty clear, militarily speaking. Japan's empire. Gone. Its navy at the bottom of the ocean, industries, ground to a halt. And U.S. forces are now sitting on Okinawa, right on Japan's doorstep. But the sheer fanatical resistance the U.S. encountered on islands like Okinawa, Iwo Jima, it made the idea of landing on the main Japanese islands just terrifying, the potential cost.
Astronomical. So the U.S. had to find alternatives to a full-scale land invasion. They were desperately looking for another way. Hashtag tag 2.1, the failure of precision and the rise of firebombing. Initially, the U.S. Army Air Forces tried to stick to more traditional rules of engagement, at least in theory. They attempted high-altitude precision bombing.
Aiming only for military targets, factories, infrastructure.
That was the idea. But it failed.
Yeah.
Spectacularly, actually.
Yeah.
The B-29 superfortresses were flying at 30,000 feet.
And the jet stream up there?
Exactly. The winds were so strong, the bombs were missing their targets by miles. It just wasn't effective.
So the strategy had to change. And it changed drastically.
Dramatically and brutally. In early 1945, General Curtis LeMay, who headed the XXI Bomber Command, basically threw precision bombing out the window.
And what did he replace it with?
Low-level strategic incendiary attacks, specifically targeting Japan's densely packed cities, which were largely made of wood and paper.
And LeMay was pretty blunt about his mission, wasn't he?
He was. Famously chilling words. His goal was to burn the place to the ground.
It burnt him.
It was a calculated move, based entirely on the architecture. LeMay had his B-29 stripped of defensive guns and ammunition to carry the maximum possible payload of incendiary bombs, M69 clusters filled with napalm.
And these weren't designed to destroy concrete bunkers.
No, not at all. They were designed to crash right through the thin, tiled roofing common in Japanese homes and then spew fire, creating these uncontrollable blazes that would merge together.
Tree firestorms.
Exactly. And the first major test of this was the Tokyo firebombing on the night of March 9th, 1945.
What happened that night?
Over 300 B-29s flew in low and dropped about 500,000 of these incendiary bombs. What followed wasn't just a fire, it was a firestorm of, epic proportions.
Epic proportions? What does that even mean in this context?
The heat generated was so intense it created its own weather system. Hurricane-force winds that literally sucked people into the flames. Our sources describe lakes and canals boiling. Pilots flying a mile high reported smelling burning flesh.
Oh my God, the human cost.
In that single night, over 250,000 homes were just incinerated. 1 million people were left homeless instantly. And the initial death toll stood at over 100,000 people.
100,000 dead in one night.
In one raid, making it the single deadliest air raid in the history of warfare. More immediate deaths than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
And this wasn't just Tokyo.
No, this wasn't a one-off terror event. It became a sustained, systematic campaign. Over the next few months, LeMay's firebombing campaign hit 58 major Japanese cities.
58 cities.
Killing an estimated 260,000 people in total, leaving 13 million homeless. LeMay was so brutally effective that by the summer, he was essentially running out of viable targets to burn.
Which brings us to the moral line, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The U.S. was now undeniably, indiscriminately targeting civilian populations on a massive scale, hoping to break the will of the government.
Did LeMay himself understand the implications?
Who absolutely did. He famously confided to his aide, Robert McNamara, yes, that Robert McNamara, that if we lose the war, we will be tried as war criminals.
Wow, he knew.
He knew the gravity of the shift. The strategic desperation was palpable. The U.S. was willing to cross significant moral and legal lines to avoid that land invasion. But even this, even burning cities to the ground, didn't work. Japan's military leadership refused to yield.
So firebombing on this massive, horrific scale, it fails to force a surrender, which meant military planners had to confront the nightmare scenario, Operation Downfall, the actual land invasion of the Japanese home islands.
The inevitable fallback. And the scale of this planned operation, it was just staggering. It was designed in two main phases.
Right. Phase one was?
Phase one, codenamed Operation Olympic. That was the invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost main island. Scheduled for autumn 1945, it would require assembling 700,000 American men just for that initial assault.
700,000 just for the first part.
Just for Kyushu. Phase two was Operation Coronet, planned for March 1946. That would target Honshu, the main island, and specifically the Tokyo Plain. That required an estimated 1.2 million American soldiers.
Good Lord. The sheer numbers and the casualty projections, that's what really drove the fear, wasn't it?
Absolutely terrifying. The fighting on Okinawa had been incredibly brutal, resulting in a devastating 35% casualty rate for American forces involved.
35%.
So when U.S. strategists applied that same rate to Operation Downfall, they projected over 700,000 American casualties, possibly approaching 1 million killed, wounded, or missing.
1 million casualties.
It was guaranteed to be the bloodiest campaign of the entire war, by far, just for the American side.
But that wasn't the whole picture, was it? What about the Japanese defense plan?
Right. Those American estimates, horrifying as they were, might have actually been optimistic. Because the Japanese defensive plan, Ketsugo Operation Decision, was rooted in that same fanaticism we discussed.
Bushido and State Shinto again.
Exactly. The military leadership genuinely believed it was better to sacrifice every living soul in the nation, literally, rather than suffer the shame of surrender and occupation.
Every living soul. So what did Ketsugo actually look like?
It meant the mass mobilization of the entire civilian population capable of putting up a fight. Men aged 15 to 60, women aged 17 to 45. We are talking about 28 million people.
28 million civilians mobilized for defense.
Mobilized for suicide defense, really. And what were they armed with? Not modern weapons for the most part. They had clubs, ancient ceremonial swords, bamboo spears sharpened at the end.
Bamboo spears against U.S. Marines.
Yes. Children were literally being trained to strap explosives to their backs and run under American tanks. The ideological commitment was total, absolute. They intended to turn every beach, every village, every home into a fortress defended to the death by fanatics.
It sounds less like a military strategy and more like state-sanctioned mass suicide.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And it was bolstered by the terrifying kamikaze preparations.
They still had planes for that.
Oh, yes. The Japanese Army General Staff had gathered over 10,000 aircraft, mostly older planes, training planes converted for one-way missions on Kyushu alone. Two-thirds of these were specifically dedicated for suicide strikes against the U.S. invasion fleet.
10,000 suicide planes aimed at the fleet before they even landed.
American naval analysts projected that this kamikaze force could potentially disable or sink up to 50%, half of the entire invasion fleet, before the first American soldier set foot on the beach.
Half the fleet gone before the landings even start.
So for Truman and his advisors, looking at all this, the conclusion was just inescapable. Operation Downfall would be an open-ended, unbelievably bloody catastrophe. Millions of lives lost on both sides. And even then, it still might not guarantee a timely surrender from this leadership. The ideological wall just seemed too high to break with conventional military means alone. Hashtag 2.3, the dawn of the atomic age. But of course, unknown to the Japanese leadership, and indeed most of the world, a third ultimate alternative was rapidly reaching maturity in the deserts of New Mexico.
The Manhattan Project.
Manhattan Project. A staggering effort cost $2 billion back then, which is immense, led by General Leslie Groves and the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Involved 130,000 people, all racing against time and against the Germans initially to create the atomic weapon.
And that race ended dramatically in July 1945.
July 16th, 1945. The Trinity test, a single device, nicknamed Gadget, detonated with a force of 24 kilotons of TNT. The scale of that explosion, the fireball hotter than the sun. It just shook the New Mexico desert.
And the psychological impact on those who witnessed it. Oppenheimer's famous quote.
Right. Watching the test, Oppenheimer recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He understood the threshold they had crossed.
So the weapon exists. It works. The moral debate immediately shifts to Washington, right, to Truman.
Immediately. Truman was actually at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, meeting with Churchill and Stalin, when he received the coded message confirming the Trinity test's success. Suddenly, he had this ultimate tool, this potential way out of the guaranteed bloodbath of Operation Downfall.
And that led directly to the Potsdam Declaration.
10 days later, July 26, 1945, the Allied leaders Truman, Churchill, who was soon replaced by Attlee after the UK election, and Chiang Kai-shek of China issued the Potsdam Declaration. It was a formal, non-negotiable ultimatum.
Demanding unconditional surrender.
Unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The terms were explicit and punitive, designed to utterly eliminate Japanese militarism forever.
What were the key terms?
Demanded the occupation of Japan, restricting Japanese sovereignty just to the four main islands, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, establishing fundamental human rights. And the final line left absolutely no room for interpretation. Japan faced prompt and utter destruction if they refused.
Prompt and utter destruction. Pretty clear threat. How did Japan respond?
Japan's immediate response was, from a strategic standpoint, a complete disaster, a political failure of the highest order. Prime Minister Suzuki, under intense pressure from his military advisors who still believed they could fight on or get better terms,
He chose to ignore it.
he chose to respond with the term mokusatsu.
Mokusatsu, what does that mean?
Well, that's the problem. It's highly ambiguous. Suzuki later claimed he meant no comment or that they were withholding judgment while they discussed it internally. But the literal translation is closer to killing with silence or treating with silent contempt.
Not a great choice of words when facing annihilation.
Absolutely not. The Americans, already deeply suspicious of Japanese intentions and any perceived stalling tactics, immediately interpreted mokusatsu as a complete and utter rejection of the Potsdam terms. Headlines around the world screamed, "Japan rejects ultimatum."
And that sealed the decision.
That interpretation, right or wrong, sealed Truman's decision to proceed with using the atomic bomb.
Okay, so the decision is made, but it's often simplified, isn't it? Just presented as Truman dropped the bomb to save American lives.
It often is, yes.
But our sources and what you've been saying suggests it was much more complex than that. A multifaceted calculation, political, geopolitical, military, all rolled into one.
Absolutely. That narrative is too simple. We really need to dissect the primary drivers behind Truman's decision because saving American lives, while hugely important, wasn't the only factor. In fact, some historians argue it wasn't even the primary factor in the end.
Okay, let's break down those reasons. What was number one?
Reason one, to hasten the end of the war. This was critical, especially for domestic political reasons. The war in Europe was over. The American public was war-weary after 4 long years. They wanted their sons, husbands, brothers home.
Support for a long, drawn-out war in the Pacific was waning?
Exactly. Truman needed a swift end. The atomic bomb was seen the only weapon potentially capable of delivering that knockout blow, of immediately breaking the Japanese military's fanatical will to resist and ending the fighting in days or weeks, not the months or possibly years that downfall might take.
Okay, makes sense. Reason 2.
Reason 2, to save American lives. This is the one everyone knows, and it was definitely a massive factor. Facing those horrifying projections, 100,000, maybe 1 million American casualties from Operation Downfall.
Unthinkable numbers.
Truman and his advisors argued, quite reasonably from their perspective, that using the bomb, despite its own horror, would ultimately result in a far smaller loss of life overall. That includes saving potentially millions of Japanese lives, too, the civilians being mobilized for that suicidal Ketsugo defense.
Right, so a terrible choice, but potentially the lesser of two evils in terms of total casualties.
That was certainly part of the calculus. But then you get to the geopolitical factor.
Okay, reason 3.
Reason 3. To prevent Soviet expansion. Now, this is where the emerging Cold War context becomes absolutely paramount. Joseph Stalin, who already controlled half of Europe.
He had promised to enter the war against Japan.
Yes. At the Yalta Conference, he committed to declaring war on Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat. That 3-month deadline was May 8th plus 3 months. So August 8th, 1945. It was fast approaching.
So dropping the bomb before then.
Dropping the atomic bomb and forcing a quick Japanese surrender before the Soviets could make significant inroads in Asia was crucial. It would deny Stalin the time needed to invade and conquer territory, especially Manchuria, northern China, maybe even Korea, or parts of Japan itself.
It ensured the U.S. would be the primary occupying power.
Exactly. It ensured that the United States, and not the Soviet Union, would control the post-war occupation of Japan and dictate the terms of peace in the Pacific. Truman absolutely did not want a divided Japan like they were already seeing happen in Germany and Eastern Europe. The bomb was a way to slam the door shut on Soviet ambitions in East Asia.
So the clock was ticking, not just for the invasion, but for the start of the Cold War, essentially.
You could definitely see it that way. The bomb guaranteed, or was hoped to guarantee, a speedy, single-occupier surrender.
Okay, and the final reason?
And finally, reason 4, a display of power. Using the bomb wasn't just about ending this war, it was about shaping the post-war world. Its successful use secured America's place as the unchallenged global superpower.
A message to the world, especially the Soviets.
Primarily directed at Stalin, yes. It was an unmistakable demonstration of the unprecedented destructive capability the U.S. now possessed. It signaled very clearly the immense danger any nation faced if they even considered going to war with America in the future. It was, as the Potsdam Declaration warned, a demonstration of the ability to deliver a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen.
Okay. So Japan's mokusatsu, the rejection, sealed it. Hiroshima was struck by a little boy on August 6th. Instant death toll estimated around 80,000. Truman issues another warning.
But Japan remained paralyzed, silent, still deadlocked.
So 3 days later, August 9th, Fat Man, a more powerful 21-kiloton bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki. The surrounding hills thankfully offered some protection.
Yes, the geography limited the immediate blast damage compared to Hiroshima.
But still, 35,000 people killed instantly. The world just waited, horrified. 2 cities wiped off the map in 3 days. The atomic attacks had definitely created that external military crisis you mentioned.
No question.
But the question remained. For a government consumed by this ideology of annihilation, was even this enough to break that internal deadlock?
So by August 9th, 1945, Japan is militarily defeated, economically ruined, 2 cities atomized. But its political system, crucially, was still totally paralyzed. The decision to surrender, yes or no, hinged entirely on one specific governing body.
This is the Big Six you mentioned earlier.
The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, informally known as the Big Six. And the critical point here is that any major policy shift, like, say, surrendering, required unanimous consensus among these 6 men.
Unanimous, not majority rule.
Unanimous, which, given the makeup of the council, was a recipe for deadlock.
Let's look at who these 6 were again, because the balance or imbalance is key here.
Absolutely. The council was fundamentally weighted against peace. 4 of the 6 were staunch militarists, absolutely committed to continuing the war or getting impossible terms.
Who were they?
You had War Minister Korechika Anami, a powerful figure. Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, Navy Chief of Staff Somu Toyota. And Slightly more moderate, but still a military man, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai. That's 4.
4 military leaders. Who were the other 2?
The sole consistent advocate for peace was the foreign minister, Shigenori Tugu, and the 6th member was the prime minister, Kantaro Suzuki. He chaired the meetings, but he had very little actual power to enforce peace against the will of the military chiefs.
And the emperor, Hirohito, where did he fit in?
Officially, constitutionally, despite his divine status and state Shinto ideology, Emperor Hirohito was only a figurehead in government. He would traditionally rubber stamp policies decided by the cabinet or the council. He lacked the established political or military authority to just unilaterally order a surrender, especially against the wishes of those powerful generals.
So the system was designed for consensus, but the key players were fundamentally opposed.
Precisely. However, the grim reality of the war had forced the forbidden subject of peace onto the table months earlier. There was a catalyst.
What was that?
It was something called the Sakomizu Report, compiled back in May 1945 by the Chief Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu. It was a cold, hard, factual assessment of Japan's remaining material resources, and the findings were absolutely damning.
Give us some of the details. How bad was the economic situation by May 45?
Total collapse wasn't imminent. It had basically arrived. Steel production was down 70% from its peak. Munitions production had been halved because they just didn't have enough coal. The entire transportation system, trains, shipping was failing because of the lack of fuel from the blockade.
They were getting desperate for alternatives, weren't they?
Unbelievably desperate. The government was literally trying to create aviation fuel from the root oils of pine trees, and trying to supplement the national diet by telling people to harvest acorns.
Acorns and pine roots. Not exactly a sustainable war economy.
Not remotely. And the human cost was already immense even before the atomic bombs. The official food ration was supposed to be 1,500 calories a day, but even that low target was rarely met. The average citizen was likely consuming barely 500 calories a day by this point.
Starvation levels.
Pretty much. The Sakomizu report concluded bluntly that widespread civil unrest and mass starvation were inevitable very soon, unless the war ended.
So when this devastating report was presented to the Big Six, what happened? Did it break the deadlock then?
Not quite, but it forced the discussion. Admiral Yonai, the Navy minister, actually suggested they approach the Soviet Union, which was still officially neutral towards Japan, and ask them to mediate a peace settlement with the Allies.
Asking Stalin to mediate, that seems incredibly naive in hindsight.
It shows just how desperate and frankly how ideologically blinded the military leaders were. They clung to this hope that the Soviets would want a strong, independent Japan after the war, maybe as a buffer against American influence in Asia. They thought Stalin might help them avoid unconditional surrender.
But Togo, the foreign minister, he saw the flaw in that.
Togo was the only one with real geopolitical foresight here. He warned them forcefully that asking Stalin for help was hopeless. He knew Japan's fate had likely already been sealed between the Allies at conferences like Yalta. He knew Stalin wouldn't mediate in good faith.
But the militarists overruled him.
They sided with trusting Stalin. So a former foreign minister, Kushi Hirota, was dispatched to Moscow on this fool's errand. And of course the Soviets just stalled. They dragged their feet, kept him waiting, all while secretly preparing their own invasion. They were just waiting for their moment. Hashtag 3.2 atomic bombs and Soviet entry.
Then came August 6th, Hiroshima, the new and most cruel bomb. How did the Big Six react initially?
It was definitely a shock. Foreign Minister Togo immediately, that same day, argued forcefully that Japan had no choice now but to accept the Potsdam terms, possibly with the sole condition of preserving the emperor.
But the military leaders,
Anami, the war minister, essentially dismissed it. He argued it might not even be an atomic bomb. Maybe it was just a very large conventional bomb, maybe some kind of American psychological trick. He demanded a full scientific investigation before they even considered changing policy based on this one event.
Incredible denial.
It shows the depth of the psychological barrier they had erected against the reality of defeat. It actually took Japan's foremost nuclear scientist, Dr. Yoshio Nishina, visiting Hiroshima and reporting back to confirm unequivocally that yes, this was indeed a nuclear weapon.
And even then,
the hardliners, Anami especially, clung to the belief that the Americans probably only had one bomb, or maybe just a very few. They argued Japan could endure one or two such attacks and fight on.
They were wrong about that. But before Nagasaki, something else happened. Something arguably even more significant in breaking the deadlock.
Absolutely. The true destabilizing geopolitical earthquake hit on August 8th. While Japan was still desperately hoping for some kind of positive response from the neutral Soviet Union.
Molotov calls in the Japanese ambassador.
Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov summons Ambassador Sato, and instead of offering mediation, reads him a declaration of war. The Soviet Union was entering the war against Japan, honoring its obligations made to the Allies months earlier.
And the invasion began immediately.
At midnight, August 9th, Tokyo time, 1.6 million Soviet troops, many battle-hardened veterans, secretly redeployed from the European front, poured across the border into Japanese-occupied Manchuria.
1.6 million troops.
They rapidly began destroying Japan's best remaining land army, the Kwantung Army, which is stationed there.
And this is the convergence of terror you spoke of.
Exactly. The timing was just devastating for Tokyo.
Yeah.
The news of the Soviet betrayal and the scale of this massive invasion arrived in the halls of government just moments before the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki around 11:02 a.m. on August 9th.
Wow. So Soviet invasion in Nagasaki, almost simultaneous blows.
This double shock, the atomic confirmation that America had more than one bomb, and the Soviet entry completely eliminating their last faint hope for immediate peace finally obliterated the generals' remaining illusions.
Because the Soviet invasion changed everything.
Completely. Suddenly, the possibility of the Soviets invading the Japanese home islands themselves, a prospect they feared far, far more than American occupation, given Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, became frighteningly real. The strategic situation had fundamentally, irrevocably changed in the space of about 12 hours. Hashtag 3.3, the breaking point and final deadlock.
So 2 atomic bombs, Soviet invasion. The writing is well and truly on the wall. Did the Big Six finally reach consensus then?
They all finally agreed. Yes, the war had to end. They agreed that the Potsdam Declaration must be accepted in principle. But they immediately deadlocked again, this time over the terms of acceptance. The tension in those meetings must have been astronomical.
Okay, let's break down this final split, because this decision right here was going to determine the fate of millions.
It really was. On one side, you had what became known as the one-condition offer. This was advocated by the peace faction, Foreign Minister Togo, Prime Minister Suzuki, and Navy Minister Yonai, who had shifted more firmly towards peace by now.
What was their one condition?
They argued for accepting the Potsdam Declaration, essentially as written, on the sole condition that the Allies guarantee the preservation of the emperor and the imperial system, the Kokutai. They recognized realistically this was the absolute maximum concession the Allies might even consider granting.
Okay, the one condition offer, what was the other side?
On the other side, the 3 hardline militarists, War Minister Anami, Army Chief Umezu, and Navy Chief Toyota dug in their heels. They insisted on what became the 4-condition offer.
4 conditions, what were they?
They agreed on demanding the emperor be maintained, yes. That was non-negotiable for everyone. But they added 3 totally unrealistic points. First, Japan must conduct its own disarmament, allowing Japanese officers to demobilize their own troops, supposedly to guarantee order.
Self-disarmament. Okay.
Second, Japan must have the right to conduct its own trials for any alleged war criminals.
Trying their own war criminals, unlikely the Allies would agree to that.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And third, the absolute deal breaker for the Allies. No Allied occupation of the Japanese home islands. None whatsoever.
No occupation, after everything. That's delusional.
Togo pointed that out repeatedly. He said they were asking for the terms of a victorious power, or at least a negotiated stalemate, where they were facing utter annihilation. It was completely unrealistic.
So why did Anami and the others insist? What was their rationale?
Anami in particular was desperate. He still clung to the idea of Ketsugo. He pleaded, even now, for one last chance. One final, decisive, sacrificial battle on the beaches of Japan.
The bamboo spears against the Marines.
He believed, or claimed to believe, that if they could inflict massive casualties on the initial American landing forces, even in defeat, they could force the Allies to recoil and perhaps accept the 4 conditions just to stop the bleeding.
And this is where that fanatical ideology really comes through again, isn't it?
It's laid bare. Anami's arguments revealed his true, terrifying bottom line. If they could not achieve victory on their terms, then it was better, more honorable for the entire Japanese race to be wiped out than to suffer the shame of occupation and unconditional surrender.
Did he actually say that?
He did. In one of these final frantic meetings, he argued, chillingly, that if the nation were destroyed in this final battle, it would be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower.
Destroyed like a beautiful flower.
That level of emotional, almost poetic, fanatical commitment to national suicide, it's almost impossible for us to grasp. How do you negotiate with, how do you govern against a mindset that views annihilation as beautiful and honorable?
You probably can't. So the big six remained deadlocked, 3 versus 3. What about the full cabinet?
The full cabinet meeting that afternoon also fell into the same paralyzing 3-3 deadlock over the conditions. And adding to the urgency, there's this growing false fear of a third atomic bomb.
False fear.
Apparently, an American P-51 pilot named Marcus McGilda had been shot down and captured. Under interrogation, possibly torture, he seems to have fabricated a story that the U.S. possessed 100 atomic bombs and that Tokyo was the very next target within days. This wasn't true, but the Japanese didn't know that, and it magnified the sense of impending doom.
So total paralysis.
Yep.
The military hardliners are effectively holding the entire government hostage to their suicidal demands. What happens next?
Prime Minister Suzuki, the elderly premier, realized that normal procedures, normal politics, had failed completely. Centuries of protocol had to be abandoned. He went to Marquis Kidokoichi, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, who was the emperor's closest advisor.
Then they agreed.
They agreed on the unavoidable reality. There was only one person, one authority left that might be able to break this impasse.
Suzuki declared, essentially.
The time has come. We must ask the emperor to make the decision. An imperial conference was needed. Hashtag 3.4 the imperial command and the failed coup.
Asking the emperor to directly intervene and make the decision. That was unprecedented, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Breaking centuries of tradition where the emperor just ratified decisions made by others.
Absolutely unprecedented in modern Japanese history. But Suzuki and Kido saw no other way out of the abyss. And crucially, Emperor Hirohito agreed. He consented to convene an emergency imperial conference late on August 14th. This created the opportunity for the one voice that could potentially override the military's fanaticism to finally be heard definitively.
Where did this conference take place?
It was held shortly before midnight, not in the Grand Palace halls, but down in the emperor's personal air raid shelter, a small, cramped concrete bunker known as the Obunko Annex within the palace grounds, safer from potential bombing.
So the big six, the emperor, key advisors, all crowded into this bunker. What happened?
For hours, the debate raged again. Anami and Umezu passionately, desperately repeated their demands for the 4 conditions. Togo and Yonai repeated the arguments for the 1 condition. Suzuki listened. Then finally, Prime Minister Suzuki did something else extraordinary. He broke the procedural deadlock, turned directly to the emperor, and formally asked him to express his own wishes.
Giving the emperor the floor.
Exactly. And the emperor then delivered his decision. Sources say he spoke with visible, undeniable emotion, maybe even tears in his eyes. He began by doing something else unheard of. He explicitly cited the discrepancies between the military's plans and their actual performance. He noted that the coastal fortifications promised for the final Ketsugo defense were nowhere near completion.
So he wasn't just speaking in generalities, he was directly criticizing the military's failure to prepare.
Directly, yes. He then emphasized that continuing the war would only mean further destruction for the nation and a prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty for the world. He stated quite personally that he could no longer bear to see his innocent people suffer anymore.
And the conclusion.
He concluded with the definitive command that sealed the peace. He said, essentially, "It is my decision. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The time has come where we must bear the unbearable. I swallow my own tears and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation on the basis outlined by the foreign minister."
Accepting Togo's 1 condition offer. Preserve the emperor, but accept the rest of Potsdam.
Exactly. The emperor had spoken. The divine voice had commanded peace on the Allies' terms, minus the ambiguity about his own status.
What was the reaction in that bunker?
The sources describe the moment as overwhelming. Every single man in that room, ministers, generals, admirals, aides, was apparently sobbing uncontrollably. Some were wailing. The tension, the relief, the shock, it all broke.
The deadlock was broken.
Irrevocably broken by the highest possible authority. Surrender, on the 1 condition, was officially approved by the full cabinet shortly after, by around 11 p.m. on August 14th. The next crucial step was to get this decision out to the nation and the military by recording the emperor's surrender rescript, his formal decree, for broadcast the next day. A voice the public had never, ever heard before.
But the story wasn't quite over yet, was it? There was still resistance.
Not by a long shot. Even as the recording was being prepared, a group of younger, fanatically dedicated mid-level military officers decided they could not accept this. They would stage a coup.
Led by whom?
Primarily by a major named Kenji Hatanaka, a staff officer at the War Ministry. He had tried and failed to get high-level military support, including from Anami himself, who refused to directly disobey the emperor. But Hatanaka decided to act anyway.
What was his objective?
Singular. Find and destroy the recordings of the emperor's surrender speech before they could be broadcast at noon on the 15th. If the emperor's voice wasn't heard, maybe the surrender could still be stopped. Maybe the army would rise up.
So how did they try to achieve this?
Just before 11 p.m., as the cabinet meeting ended, Hatanaka and his small group of co-conspirators launched their desperate coup attempt. They went to the commander of the Imperial Guards Division, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, demanded his support, and when he refused, they assassinated him.
They killed the commander of the guards.
Yes. And then they used Mori's official seal to issue forged orders, deploying the Imperial Guards to seize control of the palace grounds, cut phone lines, and effectively lock down the entire compound. Their frantic search began for the 2 phonograph records containing the emperor's voice.
Chaos inside the palace.
Absolute, total chaos and confusion throughout the night. The rebels were tearing through offices, interrogating palace staff, desperately searching for these 2 small discs. They actually held Emperor Hirohito incommunicado for several hours.
Did they capture anyone else important?
They narrowly missed capturing key figures. Lord Keeper Kido, the emperor's advisor, managed to escape by disguising himself as a doctor and hiding in an underground vault. Meanwhile, other rebel units separately targeted the homes of Prime Minister Suzuki and another senior advisor, Baron Hironuma. They locked them inside and set the houses on fire. Both men barely escaped with their lives.
Just incredible desperation. What about War Minister Anami during all this? The leader of the military faction, the one who argued for fighting to the death.
While the coup attempt raged through the night, Anami, the embodiment of this tragic conflict, was preparing for his own final act. He was trapped. He could not bring himself to openly defy the emperor's direct command. But equally, he could not bear the shame, as he saw it, of surrender and overseeing the dismantling of the imperial army he loved.
So he chose the traditional way out.
He committed seppuku, ritual suicide, in his office at the War Ministry around 4 a.m. on August 15th. His suicide was a massive psychological blow to the coup plotters, robbing them of their highest-ranking potential, if reluctant, supporter. He left behind a short poem and a note apologizing to the emperor for his great crime, presumably referring to the military's failure and perhaps his own role in prolonging the war. His death essentially signaled the end of the old military way.
Did Hatanaka's coup succeed in finding the records?
No. The coup ultimately failed. Palace officials, anticipating trouble, had cleverly hidden the 2 recordings. One was reportedly disguised in a pile of laundry, the other in a small vault. Hatanaka and his conspirators searched all night but never found them.
And the rest of the military didn't join them?
No. Crucially, the Eastern District Army, which controlled troops in the Tokyo area, remained loyal to the government and the emperor's decision. They moved in during the early morning hours to put down the rebellion. Seeing the cause was lost, Hatanaka.
He took his own life, too.
Yes. He and his main co-conspirator shot themselves on the palace plaza just outside the main gates, only about 40 minutes before the emperor's broadcast was scheduled to air. A final, futile gesture that perfectly symbolized the collapse of the fanatical military's attempt to hijack the nation's fate.
So the coup failed. The recordings were safe. And then came noon, August 15th, 1945.
Noon, August 15th. Across Japan and in occupied territories, millions of Japanese citizens, soldiers, civilians, men, women, children gathered around radio sets. For the very first time in history, they heard the actual voice of their emperor.
What did he say in the broadcast, the rescript?
It was formal, difficult language even for native Japanese speakers at the time. But the core message was clear. He cited the new and most cruel bomb, mentioning its power to destroy innocent lives and potentially lead to the total extinction of human civilization. He spoke of the need to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. He commanded the nation to accept the Allied terms.
And mentioning the bomb specifically gave the military cover, didn't it?
Yes, that was politically crucial. It allowed the military leadership, and indeed the whole nation, to frame the surrender not as a defeat by conventional forces or a failure of spirit, but as bowing to an irresistible, almost supernatural force, this new and most cruel bomb. It helped preserve a measure of honor, allowing them to accept the unacceptable.
So let's synthesize this whole complex story. The A-bombs, the Soviet invasion, they created the undeniable external military crisis. They destroyed the last strategic illusions.
Correct. They provided the necessary shock, the undeniable proof that continuing the war meant certain annihilation.
But those factors alone, horrific as they were, they still failed to break the internal political and ideological deadlock within the Japanese government, specifically within the Big Six.
Exactly. The military hardliners were still demanding impossible terms, still willing to sacrifice the nation for a warped sense of honor, even after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion.
So the actual decisive cause of the surrender, the trigger that finally made it happen when it did, was...
The actual cause was the unprecedented, direct, personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito. It took him, and arguably only him, breaking centuries of sacred protocol and personally intervening in the political process to mandate the acceptance of the one-condition surrender. His command made the decision final and enforceable against the desperate will of the militarists like Anami.
And it's fascinating when you consider Hirohito's own motivations, isn't it? It wasn't purely altruistic concern for his people, perhaps.
That's the complex, perhaps uncomfortable final layer. When Hirohito was questioned later, privately about his motivations, particularly regarding the timing, his answers suggest his primary concern might have been preserving the imperial institution itself, the Kokutai, and his own position on the throne.
How so?
Well, his uncle, Prince Asaka, reportedly asked him after the war if he would have continued fighting if the Allies hadn't implicitly agreed, through diplomatic channels, to allow the emperor to remain, at least symbolically. And Hirohito reportedly replied, quite frankly, of course.
Of course he would have continued fighting if his own position wasn't guaranteed.
That's the implication. So, in wanting to preserve the throne, the very institution at the heart of the State Shinto ideology that drove the war, he inadvertently, perhaps, became the instrument that saved millions of Japanese lives from the annihilation his own generals were contemplating. The man at the center of the war ideology was the only one with the unique authority to finally dismantle it and command peace. Hashtag outro.
It really is a profound historical irony, isn't it? The military leadership, consumed by this ideology that literally preferred total national annihilation to the shame of surrender, they kept the war going after Tokyo was incinerated, after the first atomic bomb fell, even after the Soviets invaded Manchuria. It took the intervention of the most sacred figure in their entire worldview, the divine ruler himself, to finally defy that military machine and mandate peace.
And this intervention, this specific sequence of events, had just immense, lasting consequences for the post-war world, didn't it?
Oh, so?
Well, precisely because Hirohito remained on the throne, even as the symbolic figurehead stripped of divinity, the subsequent Allied occupation, led primarily by the American General Douglas MacArthur, and lasting for 7 years, was made politically possible, even relatively smooth.
Hirohito provided legitimacy.
He provided the essential legitimacy. He was able to publicly endorse the occupation, legitimize the new democratic constitution the Americans largely wrote, and even issued the famous Humanity Declaration in 1946, formally renouncing his own divinity.
Which must have been a shock in itself.
A massive shock. But his continued presence provided this crucial bridge from the old Japan to the new. It allowed Japan to transition remarkably quickly from a society dominated by the military for centuries into a stable, peaceful, democratic nation. And, critically for the emerging Cold War, into a key U.S. ally in the East.
Avoiding the complete political and social implosion that might have happened otherwise.
Almost certainly would have happened if the military hardliners had won that final internal battle, or if the emperor hadn't been there to sanction the surrender and the occupation.
Which leaves us, as always, with a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Given the absolute, almost unbelievable depth of ideological conviction shown by someone like War Minister Anami, a man who genuinely seemed to prefer seeing his entire nation destroyed like a beautiful flower rather than surrender, had the emperor not intervened that night in the air raid bunker? Had he remained silent, adhering to tradition? Could any amount of further destruction, even the vaporization of Tokyo by a third or fourth atomic bomb, which the Japanese feared was coming, have actually resulted in anything other than the total, deliberate self-immolation of the Japanese nation orchestrated by its own leaders? It raises the chilling possibility that the internal political paralysis fueled by ideology was perhaps even stronger than the external military force the Allies could bring to bear.